everybody. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. It's my great pleasure today to welcome you to our BCCJ event entitled Education 2020, Crisis-Driven Change. This today is in collaboration with Talk Education Tokyo and RSA Japan Fellows Network. For those of you who joined our last couple of education events, we had one last December, which was an in-person hackathon pre-COVID, and one earlier this year on the challenges and opportunities within education in a COVID world. For those of you who attended those, welcome back. For those who are new, welcome. We're delighted to have you. This evening we have three fantastic speakers and one fantastic moderator. I will leave our moderator to introduce our speakers today and also to give a little bit of an overview context into today's event. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kirsten O'Connor, who wears many hats. You will see in her background, she is the founder and director of Quest Tokyo. She also wears an RSA hat and Talk Education Tokyo. So without further ado, Kirsten, over to you.
Sarah, thank you very much. And thank you to the BCCJ for all the tech support in helping to organise and deliver this joint event this evening with the RSA Japan Fellows Network and, as you mentioned, Talk Education Tokyo. Welcome everyone to the second joint event, which this year includes Talk Education Tokyo. And for those of you that joined us last year in December, that was the time when we launched that small group. It's a great pleasure to see participants from around the globe, not least two of our panelists who join us from the Netherlands and Turkey today. And please excuse those of us at this end of the day on Tuesday in Tokyo referring to this evening throughout the event. I'm delighted to be talking today with three of my most respected fellow educationalists. Dr. Yuko Itatsu, Associate Professor from the University of Tokyo. Good evening, Dr. Itatsu.
Good evening.
And Sue Aspinall, Executive Head at the British School of the Netherlands. Good evening, Sue.
Good evening, you and everybody.
And Education and Developmental Economist, Ziva Olmez. Hi, Ziva.
Hello, good evening. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining me. I've been very much looking forward to our conversation and I very much appreciate your time and your experience. So during this event, we're going to be talking about the huge impact 2020 has had on education so far and the potential changes on the horizon. If you'd like to ask questions, please do use the chat function and we will try to answer some questions as we go along. And if time permits, we will also try to take some verbal questions during the session. And I'm reliably informed that we will close the session after 90 minutes. Some of us will need to continue with our day, other of us will be finishing our day. So I think we can all agree that 2020 has been extraordinary. Many will be familiar with the oft quoted phrase, never waste a good crisis, attributed variably to Winston Churchill and more recently to Rahm Emanuel. The expression could not be more pertinent this year. I think pausing to reflect as educationalists, when in modern history has schooling from preschools to university in the majority of countries across the world been simultaneously suspended? This truly is, and to employ an overused, but entirely in this case accurate word, unprecedented. During this session, we plan to explore how we as educational practitioners and leaders can leverage this opportunity. Over the past 2 decades, talk of the need to modernise education to meet the needs of the future, that unfortunately tired expression, how can we meet the needs of 21st century learners? Well, is this the opportunity? Many use the expression school and university closure during the first half of this pandemic year between March and July. We must acknowledge that this was not the case. Schools were not closed, universities were not closed. Professors and teachers and leaders were frantically trying to retool their new digital toolkits to deliver educational continuity online, in many cases over one weekend. Is this a once-in-a-century opportunity to imagine a new future, a new educational paradigm? So to start off with, How have the ramifications of COVID-19 affected your work and role over the past few months? Sue, I'm going to jump straight to you in school there in the Netherlands.
Thank you, Kirsten. In many ways, the answer to that, and it's still changing as we go, I think the most impactful thing is trying to find a way of educating students, whether they're at home or attending on an alternate basis to school. And now we're in a situation where the school is open and we do have students who have to quarantine. So it's managing small groups of students being out rather than big year groups or classes. So that's one aspect of it, is keeping the education rolling and continuous for our students so they don't feel they're missing out on anything and they're still part of the school and the community. For the teachers, it's transformed their practice actually in many ways. They've had to take on board use of technology so that they can get information out to students but also interact with them, and have done that in an amazing way. And I think if you talk to any teachers, they're just absolutely gassed at how much they've actually managed to do, including me, in terms of upskilling. And I think the other thing for me personally is that I have a very different relationship with my parent body now. So the clients, I work in a private school, and I've had to work really, really carefully with them, hold their hands, be very closely integrated with what they need in their families and how we can serve them. And actually, I think I've come through it with a much closer and more understanding relationship both ways, actually, with our parents and families.
So in some ways, there are things to thank COVID for. In that respect, do you think that the parents have got a different insight into education now? I felt that as parents were kind of witnessing online learning, really, they were getting a much clearer window into the experiences that their children were having each day. Have you felt that with your parents?
I think that's really true. I work in a 3 to 18, 3 to 11 school. That's the part of the campus that I oversee. And I think that initially the parents found it incredibly challenging trying to look after their children and balance work. So that was the biggest challenge for those families that had multiple children or had younger children particularly. And initially many of our families thought that we could occupy their child online at 3 years old. And it was kind of changing that whole understanding about what children need and what the learning environment, offers them on a day-to-day basis. So particularly for our 3 to 5 year olds, the parents very quickly realized that, they would have to alter their day, become the guiding adult, and that we would do what we could to send out activities and ideas for them to do at home. For our other children, I mean, the parents needed guidance, particularly with things like writing, how to teach writing. Reading was not so much an issue. Maths, the pedagogies changed, so they were struggling with how to manage that. So I think what we've learned is 2 ways: how to support our parents with how they support their child, the co-educator role, but also it's given parents an incredible insight actually into how their own child learns and what they can do to support that in a very positive way actually. And if you've got teachers who can coach the parents, which is what my teachers did, they personalized it, they sent guidance notes, they sent little videos that were instructionally based. And in that way, our parents have really got a success out of it as well in supporting their kids. So it's just been a very, very interesting journey, and we're still on it.
Yeah, very much. We're not through the tunnel yet, are we? We're still in that tunnel. And, yeah, exactly. Yuko, how has your kind of day-to-day experience been affected over the last few months?
Well, I'd say that it's been remarkably good. You mentioned never waste a good crisis, and I think that's exactly what's happened in a way. The students have responded remarkably well to online instruction. They have been a bit tired of staring at the computer for 8 hours a day and having also instructors really trying to cram in everything. into the online environment. So there's a lot more instruction, there's a lot more assignments, there's a lot more kind of additional material that the students needed to self-study. And so by the end of last semester, the students were actually verbally complaining, and they don't tend to complain at all, but they were verbally finally complaining that it's a bit too much, and they were not able to do it. It didn't help that they, especially the first year students, had a very difficult time creating a community. So even though they were taking classes together, they really couldn't get to know each other, which meant that they weren't getting information on how to cope with this environment, or also and also not being able to kind of gauge where they were in the classroom or academically. So that was quite difficult. I think for the most part, my classes were heavily discussion based. And so we try to keep it kind of loose, and as humor was so important in this environment, we just need to keep it a little bit light so that they keep going. But we used online whiteboards and other kinds of tools to make sure that they were engaged. But yeah, so that's what's been happening. Maybe I'll say a little bit more about how the instructors have responded as well. I think I shouldn't speak for all universities in Japan, but I can say that typically universities have tended to be more complacent with their pedagogy and their teaching and learning. They haven't done as much reflection on improving based on research or research evidenced improvements. And so what's been remarkable with COVID-19 is that from top to bottom at universities, everybody's been talking about education. That doesn't happen much, at least in my institution. And so seeing the executive managers, the vice presidents come to the weekly teaching discussions, weekly lunch meetings for teaching and learning, that's been remarkable. And even my colleagues who normally are really research-based and research-focused, they were talking also about how to actually use these tools to make sure the students were understanding exactly what they wanted to convey. So that was a major step forward, I'd say. Some of the funny things were more to do with the discussions the technology being used to replicate what they already do. So we have 3,000 students take an English exam every semester, and they all have to take it at the same time, and they all have to come into school and all that. But so we were trying to figure out ways to replicate that online, and that just became impossible. I mean, at the end, they kind of tried to manage it, but so whether we were using COVID to actually technologically advance is one question. And the second question was whether we were actually really taking advantage of it to change a curriculum. That was a second and separate question.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touch a little bit on exams there, and we'll come back to that a bit later, because that certainly is an opportunity. Perhaps COVID has presented us with an opportunity or a corner around which we can peer to perhaps a different paradigm in that area. Thank you, Yuko. And Ziva, how has your experience been affected?
Well, you know, I've been in Turkey for the past year, and it's been interesting to just talk to my neighbors and my community and look at what their children have been experiencing. There's quite a lot to unpack. I mean, first of all, I've realized that parents have probably never, since probably subsistence farming, at least in the Western world, spent so much time with their children. And so, you know, they're coming to really get to know their children very well and asking some very key questions. It's also highlighting the fact that in many schools, I mean, not every school does it this way, but most schools are not as inclusive as they can be in terms of getting the parents involved in the children's learning journey. And so the parents and the children have noticed that there's a serious gap there. And so, you know, parents, for example, don't know how best they could support their children during this time. There's also a sense that all of this is temporary. And so we just have to hold out until things get back to normal. And that's creating a little bit of resistance when it comes to asking key questions about pedagogy, about curriculum design, and probably about school design as well. I mean, if we look at traditional school designs and facilities, they are specifically built for, in-person contact. All of a sudden, when we have a situation like this, and it doesn't have to be this, it could be a natural disaster, it could be a war crisis. All of a sudden, that huge facility is not as useful, not as utilized as it could be. And I think we need to ask some very key questions and bring in other disciplines, in terms of design, architecture, psychology, on how we can improve those areas. Because this is probably not going to be an isolated incident, I think, in our history. And I think these are the sorts of things that I've been observing. But I think another area that we probably aren't talking about enough leading up to this crisis is, how is it that children, especially between the ages of 10 and say 14, 10 and 16, are absorbing and consuming content and information. If we look at the way they consume content information through social media and online, it's very difficult for them to realize what is relevant. It's very difficult for them to look at information more three-dimensionally and pick and choose carefully and curate for themselves what is relevant, absorb that, and then turn that into their own long-term development. We don't teach that enough. We don't teach students, at least in our traditional pedagogy and curricula, how to develop that sort of intuition. And the reason for that is we follow a very well-structured curriculum. Globally, and curricula globally as well as pedagogy have been converging, haven't they? So we're noticing that there is structure is inherently good, but if somebody else is curating information for you and managing your time for you, then in a situation like this, where the children should be managing that for themselves, inadequacies start surfacing quite quickly.
Yeah, this has really highlighted that, actually. And for younger children, of course, you're always going to curate the narrative and you're going to help them navigate that learning. But certainly for older students, it will have raised that issue. I mean, we talked a little bit about how amazing it was actually to see in September how much excitement there was from students to go back to the building. I think sort of globally there has been the biggest excitement ever to go back to school, having been off school since March, which is a delight to see. But I wonder, with the opportunity for greater use of technology now, and we've seen that there's possibilities and the hybrid nature of the opportunity that's presenting itself, what are the kind of some of the considerations, if you like, for continuing this wholly in-person schooling? And if you're thinking about it from an economic sense, if you think about big companies, certainly in Tokyo now, I know a lot of the very large companies are thinking about downsizing their footprint in terms of rent, because they've had half of their workforce working at home. And why wouldn't you do that? It would immediately have an impact on your bottom line. Is that going to perhaps be an issue for schools, do you think, in the future, Ziva?
Yes, certainly. I mean, school buildings, facilities are extremely difficult to design, and they're very expensive to build. And once you commit to a particular design, you're stuck with it for years. It's difficult to undo. I think, yes, there will be very deep conversations taking place around lean design, around flexible learning, agile, perhaps an agile approach to learning and teaching in the classroom. Maybe a greater emphasis on managing one's time, managing information through better note-taking, definitely a stronger focus on writing, which was already missing, in my view, in many schools, because, what the reason why one should write well is because it helps one think and arrange their own mental structures, if you will. And I think that we don't, again, that's been sidelined a little bit, and that needs to come back quite strongly in our education system.
Yuko, do you think it will have an impact on universities with, the amount of space that universities currently occupy inside and outside of cities, do you think that having a large proportion of the parent body working remotely will have an impact on that?
Well, I was just about to say, although online instruction has been successful, I think there's still so much value in in-person instruction and in-person discussion, actually. That's what's really been difficult, having everything online. Of course, we've made the best out of the situation, but it's just been rather difficult to actually engage at a deeper level at a conversation in some ways. And I think especially for younger students, it's been a hindrance to be able to engage properly. And you show so much, you communicate so much with your body, even if you're in a discussion. And I think that's something that, so I understand what Zivra is trying to say, and I think there's definitely something that needs to happen. I think, especially when it comes to universities and their economy and how much they're struggling financially as well. So there's definitely room for discussion on that. But I would say the physical space is also crucial in learning.
I think that's certainly been the case, hasn't it been, for primary students? Being out of school has had particularly for the younger ones, Key Stage 1, early years children, it's very difficult for them to be independent learners. They're not independent learners even at school. So why would they be at home? And they need that physicality, don't they? But I suspect buildings, in terms of the crisis that's driving, change, will perhaps not have too much of an impact on schools for primary age.
It depends really how you look at it. I mean, I think what's happened over the last months is that in primary and secondary, we've become much more aware of what the curriculum needs to look like for a student, like what's really important for them to have access to in terms of content that might be deliverable online, and then what is the aspect that is absolutely crucial for you to engage in when they're actually face to face. And for the youngest students, and I think it goes all the way through, is that they want the social contact with their peers. That's the big thing, and to know that their teacher's still there, and to get that sense of belonging within a class or a group. The very young children, they want the space, they want the ability to play in a safe environment that they're used to, and the interaction from their friends obviously within it. So I think what it's doing for us as educators is really crystallizing what is important. And if you have the luxury we have the luxury of thinking about our students, what is right for them, and designing the curriculum from there. So I think two things are coming out of it are really questioning, a big question around what should the curriculum be. And I agree with Ziga that we're in primary stripping right back to our core curriculum, making sure that our students are really well grounded in their literacy skills and in their numeracy skills and their scientific skills. And then it's also thinking about how best we use the time in school. And, our children need space, they need to go outdoors, we extended playtime even when they first came back, just to give them that social interaction. And like you were saying, Yuko, about giving them chance for discussion, the older ones, but going deeper and giving time to that. So releasing the constraints of the timetable to let the learning flow in the right way. So these are all really great things that have come out of having to look differently at what we do.
And that's exactly what we're talking about.
Can I just add, so we're talking about the curriculum right now, but also, as Sue just mentioned, recess time, or just the time to hang out, has been something that's been sorely lacking, especially with the university students as well. And so just from, walking from one classroom to another, or just walking together to the canteen and just getting lunch, that kind of time is actually where some other kinds of learning happen. And I think we've had to ignore that part while we are in survival mode. But I wonder whether we can reintroduce that somehow to create a community online, even for university students, as they try to navigate through this pandemic. So that's something else. So outside of the course instruction, how do we make sure that we're building a community? That's going to be crucial, I think.
And it's probably streamlined what you are now prioritizing. I mean, we talk about the importance of the network that you build when you're certainly an older student in secondary school, but definitely when you're at university. The kind of people that you meet there flow through your career. And some of the students are having a very different experience in their first months of university. And I think that's been a real difficulty. And as you say, everybody's in survival mode at the moment, and we kind of prioritize learning, don't we? We've prioritized the curriculum, but you're right to point out that in some ways we will have to reevaluate where are the most important aspects, the most purposeful aspects, not just the student union experience that students get, but the positive career elements of those social aspects. So there's much talk, isn't there? You know, this has been an interrupted period of time for students, and I think there's concern across all sectors that there will be an impact in the long term. And actually, if you listen to, you know, a lot of stuff on media and on social media, people are talking about this generation, how it will affect them in the future. Have you seen evidence of students either being behind or dramatically affected by the last 6 months?
I mean, in the context that I work in, you know, we've got parents that have been able to adapt their time to be able to support their children. So it's quite, I mean, I know that we're very fortunate in the co-educating role that we've had with parents. But to be honest, when the children came back to school, I felt that in many cases they were ahead of what I would expect. There was a bit of a worry. But particularly our you know, key stage 2 children, so that's the ones that are 7 to 11, for example, because they'd really enjoyed the one-to-one at home, the time to be able to go into depth in the writing, for example. And I think a lot of it was the way our teachers gradually adapted what they were sending home, so that the children had a bit more scope to take that to different depth. And that's what the children said to me. They really loved not having time constraints, being able to have their snack when they wanted and carry on writing for a bit longer. They loved the conversations they were able to have with their parents. And we've actually just carried on. You know, we've adjusted the curriculum a little bit. We've refined the content of that. And to be honest, I think when we get to January, you wouldn't even know. But I think that's our particular setup, because we've worked so closely with the parents and the children who are vulnerable. We've been able to put something quite bespoke in for them and give them some catch-up time when they've got back, but it's a very small percentage. What I've noticed is, you know, the older students are incredibly independent. They're very savvy now on tech. It's normal, natural for them. And they're able to adapt now, to flip backwards between being at home, being at school, because of what we put in place to kind of bookend those sections of their schooling. So I think, you know, we can't underestimate how flexible our students are. And it's really important for me to not put my assumption onto what they are actually experiencing.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, isn't it? Because we are so, as educators, system-wide, we think in systems and we think in boxes. You know, we all know what a timetable looks like, and that's how we're kind of forcing children to work in that way, particularly young children who don't think in boxes. And perhaps this has been an opportunity to open up more of an awareness amongst us as teachers and leaders that we need to have more flexibility. It's an absolute delight to hear that those students have come back and have relished the ability to be independent learners at home and to manage their own time. And of course, younger children find that more difficult, and that's natural. But to have been able to be sort of fulfilling learners, which is what our goal is. You know, we use this expression, lifelong learners. We chuck it around all the time, but that truly is that, isn't it? Actually being more aware of their own needs and their own organizational skills.
And I would think, you know, that what has added to that is that the teachers have needed to get to know their students in an even deeper way, and they've got to know the family context as well. So because you've had that ongoing backwards and forwards, in our case, initially it was emailing, adult to adult. So the parent was in a conversation with the teacher constantly about how can we do the best for my child. So you've got teachers getting a real insight into what motivates the children, what support have they got, what do they need. And it's really showing that if you've got the opportunity to personalize things in that way, you can galvanize the right kind of momentum for learning for that student. Yeah.
I think what you're describing, Sue, is the absolute gold card version of situation for COVID. And you know, I'm so respectful of the school that you lead and your leadership, but it seems as if you've been able to be so flexible in your ability to respond not just to the children's needs but to families and teachers' needs, and that seems to have been a way to have been successful in this situation. Do you think that I'm looking at the chat and there's a question here from Nikki talking about some of the schools which perhaps have not been able to be so flexible and where children have had online learning for a very long period of time. Where do you see the challenges of, you know, it says on talking about it here, where's the challenge of playing that game of catching up or focusing on the return to campus? Where's the conflict there for schools that have not necessarily been able to have been so flexible in their leadership?
For the schools that have been online for a lot longer than us, you know, I really take my hat off to the staff that keep that going and keep the momentum and the contact with the students. My advice to the staff here was, you know, when the children come back in, it's their social and emotional well-being that is the priority at the beginning. So you know, it's make sure that they have time together, that you've got structured activities, and that everybody feels that sense of inclusion and belonging straight away. But get on with the learning, because actually, you know, the children want to be back in school for the rigor and for the structure and to feel that they're immersed again in the learning that they're familiar with. So there was a balance there. And I think that don't underestimate how much the kids want to learn, and they're just thirsty for it. And I think that's the same in any socioeconomic group. I think, you know, from colleagues of mine working in London, for example, the children just want the structure, the boundaries. They want to know where they stand. They want loads of praise that's individual to them, to know that they're okay, that what they did when they were at home is fantastic. They did their best, and come on, let's just go for it. Rather than wording around, oh, you're behind, or, you know, we're going to have to do catch-up lessons or something like that. You know, that's not going to help a child in their progress. It's, this is where we're at, this is where we'll go forwards.
Yeah. And I think that applies in any, you know, we're talking about COVID, but that applies in any emergency or any crisis situation. If you think about the earthquake here in 2011, we had the same situation, didn't we? Where children wanted routine. They needed the pole around which their life revolves, which is school. They needed that to be solid. And so that was the drive, wasn't it? To get that back up and running. But I think you're right. We shouldn't ever underestimate children's desire to learn. But I mean, it comes back to that Maslow's hierarchy, doesn't it? When they feel safe, then you're moving on to those next levels. So it's
and adding to that, I mean, one of the things that the parents asked of us was to create a really warm, welcoming environment for their kids, because we can't have the parents inside. So they wanted the children to feel that sense the minute they walked in the door. And also, you know, that sense of safety and happiness. And I think if you can get that as a staff, then it kind of rolls from there. Yeah.
I think that was feedback that the schools that I'm involved in here in Tokyo, that was the feedback that they got, that the children were so excited to come back to school, but it was doubled by seeing their teachers kind of arms and eyes wide open, welcoming them back into a safe, comfortable, warm, smiling environment. Really helped. And I think that's it's been crucial. it's fascinating, isn't it? I think really over the last 6 months, some of the longer term issues that we've known about in education have really come to the fore. And now there really is a much more acute awareness of things like the inequity of education, not just nationally, but globally. Things like the inequity of internet connectivity, and even down to sort of, there's a much greater awareness now of the fragility of girls' education and how quickly that goes out of the window in some sectors in times like this. And unfortunately, even in, you know, big developed countries, the impact of poverty and food scarcity, it's hardly believable that we're seeing that in some of the most developed countries in the world, and the impact that's having on learning. And whilst, you know, we know about these challenges, I think educators are facing, not least the fact that you're trying to keep abreast of daily developments and COVID cases within schools and how to manage when you need to have year groups. I mean, it just juggling so many things, but there clearly are opportunities presenting themselves. So, you know, we're talking about the authentic and purposeful drive for integrating and immersing technology. And this is not something new. We've been talking about this since the internet came in 25 years ago. How will we use it purposefully? And what's that's driving, you know, hybrid learning styles, and also a whole new industry, really a deep industry of educational online resources. And we'll talk a bit later about the use of AI in schools, which is another thing which we talked about this previously in the year, that much like the internet coming into schools, which hit a lot of educators on the back of the head as it came in, kind of AI is going to do the same if we don't get a step in front of it. So there's lots of long discussed opportunities in education that have emerged. Ziva, I'm conscious I'm doing a lot of talking here. You mentioned when you were talking there about, you know, we've perhaps seen recently is that global pedagogy is fragile. And in a situation like this, it perhaps isn't sustainable. So how do we change pedagogy to be more sustainable, do you think?
Well, we haven't really developed any solutions to this problem. I mean, what we've done is created remedies, you know, very, very last minute remedies. And I think a lot of teachers have been facing the unknown, and as a result have taken extra precautions, gone the extra mile, to Sue's point, longer rapport with parents and each individual student where possible. And that could be one of the reasons why, at least in Sue's experience, learning outcomes have in a way improved, you know, let's but we just don't have enough time and data to be able to judge that and the effectiveness of that. I think pedagogy, and you know, if we think of it as the way we teach and learn, I think again we have to go back to instead of thinking about how do we improve pedagogy, because that's such an open-ended question, we need to think a little bit more about the learners and the context of children nowadays. You know, there's so much conversation going, and I know you really don't like this phrase, and neither do I, Kirsten, 21st century learners. I think, or you know, how do we develop a 21st century pedagogy? That's really the wrong question. I think the question is, what is the context in which we are living? How is that affecting the core values, the psychological infrastructure of children nowadays? And how do we then change and mold and improve pedagogy to better suit that? Because that's a force on its own. It's an inexorable force. It's not something that schools can affect or impact. That's organic on its own. So schools need to be not necessarily the origin of this, but rather work together with the global context, you know, of how social media is developing, how children's perceptions are developing, and so I think we're not focusing enough on that. A question that I wanted to ask Sue is, you know, I used to do a lot of work on strategic planning for schools in various countries, and that includes Southern Africa, East Asia. You know, I've worked with schools where teacher-student ratios are just beyond what you can imagine, and of course in those kinds of schools, teachers don't really have the luxury to develop that one-on-one rapport with each individual child. But time and time again, what I noticed was that the greatest determinant for student performance and happiness and achieving learning outcomes was the quality of feedback that teachers gave children. I think this is true for kindergarten and for university and everything in between. I think it's even true in the workplace, you know, between in terms of relationships between us and our superiors. But how has that changed, I wonder, in your school, for example? But I also want to ask you, at universities, has it changed, the nature and the quality of feedback that teachers are giving students?
I would say in the setting where I am, the importance of giving high quality feedback has been heightened for teachers, because they've actually seen the impact of that directly when they've been working online with students at home. And definitely when I listen in to the conversations that the teachers are having with the students now that they're back in school, they're spending time with the children, conferencing them, and it's not necessarily always about their work. Actually, it's like checking on them socially as well, and how are your relationships. I'm not saying that didn't happen before, but I think that there's more of a purpose behind it now, knowing how important that is, in order for children to keep making progress. In the when the children were working remotely, the quality of feedback that the teachers were giving in an email to the parent, which was both about the student's work and then about how that parent could support the next step. I mean, I've never seen anything like it, but it was kind of because there was a conversation going and a real partnership about trying to keep that particular child on track.
Did that emerge naturally on its own? I mean,
yeah, it did.
Yes,
Yeah, I mean, it was already in place, but it was something we were having to do a lot of professional development around. Whereas I would say now that people are, you know, the staff generally are more aware of the impact and have seen that in real time.
That's brilliant. Yeah, it's very encouraging.
Yeah.
Sorry. Some of my colleagues, this is a really good, interesting question, because I think that's somewhere where there's a lot of room for improvement still in universities. So when universities went online with their courses, some of them did real-time instruction. So we would just be conversing in real time. And then there were on-demand instructions where they posted videos and the students would self-study. And it was the on-demand videos that students really required feedback, for sure. And that was a separate task that instructors needed to start to get used to. And whether they were high quality or not is not something that I can really comment on. But I would say for my real-time courses, I really had to make an effort to verbalize feedback, which might not have always been the case when I was in a classroom with the students. If I were, you know, able to, there were lots of nonverbal communication that was possible. Physically getting nearby or nodding or just making comments like on their piece of paper or whatever it was. And I think it's had to become intentionally verbal. And also I completely agree with Stu that I kind of forced a office hour on the students. And it was in the name of a tech check that they would all have to kind of do with me. And by having the students either one-on-one or 1 to 2 or 3 students, it really allowed me to get the students to talk to me more about where they were psychologically, emotionally, and how they felt about their learning. And that helped me enormously in designing my class. And also, I think it helped them knowing that I was interested in finding that out, and that everybody was getting that kind of treatment. So I think that has probably helped a lot. There's still lots of room for improvement though on this.
I mean, you talk also, Ziva, about Generation Z or Generation Z, who are sort of obsessed with immediate feedback because they're the social media generation, and you know the need for likes and comments and views and all of that kind of thing. That's probably something we need to consider, certainly with students who are 13 plus.
Yeah, I don't. For me, in the beginning, when I was experiencing this for myself, because I love photography and I share my photos on Instagram and so on, and it's not so much looking for likes as much as it is the speed at which those likes and comments come in. So when I observe children, children within my family, as I said, neighbors at schools, I like to watch this, and it's interesting that when they share a post, for example, and the feedback, if you will, if we can call it feedback, is not immediate. There is something that hurts inside, why did this not happen? And I think there is. That's a very good example of an area where we may need to think about how we can restructure our feedback systems within schools to make them not necessarily immediate, but definitely faster and not waiting, if you will, until the end of an assignment, end of a term, end of a year to get that feedback, because it's quite difficult. I mean, we, as educators, when we walk into a classroom, for example, I'll give a very, very simple example. When we do a lot of teacher training, I was always shocked at how teachers would not re-highlight what the learning outcomes are. Where were we? Where are we now? And where are we heading? First, quick reminder, this is the narrative. This is exactly where we are in the narrative. Now let's move forward. I mean, when we have project management meetings, I like to do this with my teams. Guys, let's have a quick spot check about where we are. Teachers take that for granted because they know exactly what the narrative is and where they are, but they do take it for granted that students aren't aware of that. And I think constantly reminding them of that, and then threading in feedback on an individual basis could be very, very effective, actually, and could raise student performance.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
A question that I have in my mind, it's about productivity, but I think there are two things about productivity with children working at home and having more flexible hours about when they work, how much screen time they have with their teachers, and then when they do their assignments. I think they are slowly discovering. Again, I'm talking about the older students, exactly where when their peak productivity lies. So not every person is productive between the hours of 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. And this is equally so for the workplace. Some of my greatest ideas in the work that I've done that I'm really proud of happened sort of between midnight and 4 a.m. And it's the way I work. And I think it's important for children to discover that, and then for schools to accommodate for that.
Yeah.
But a more longer term question is, again, that generation, especially again focusing on that age group 10 to 15, 10 to 16, that experienced this in 2020 and is likely to continue experiencing this in 2021. What's going to happen to their productivity compared to 3-4 children of the same age 3-4 years ago in about 15 years time, for example, when they're in the workplace? I don't know. I think the sort of immediate response might be, their productivity will be lower, but what if it's higher? These are the questions I'd like to ask and say, well, if this is benefiting students, I'm not talking about COVID specifically, but obviously, but being at home and learning from home and going into school, maybe not every day, and not having to structure their learning and fix their learning between a specific time interval. That flexibility, is it going to generate more productive, more socially responsible human beings? If so, then we really need to rethink the way we structure schools.
Yeah, and this is very contemporary, and we're not going to have enough data for some time, but it is definitely something to consider. We've had a few questions come through while we've been talking. I'm just going to throw some out there. There's a couple here for you, Yuko, but also for Sue and Ziva to consider. First one was, what actual steps have there been to help students meet each other, especially new students coming from regions and not knowing anybody? Coming into the city, for instance, have there been moves for that, Yuko?
That's a really good question. I think there hasn't been enough done. What's happened is that the students have been relatively good at organizing themselves, which has been a real savior in a way, where the university lacked the students self-organized. So what often happens is that there's groups that the students are put in classrooms based on maybe second foreign language or whatever it is. There's certain groups, they're not just randomly there. So there's structure, and this within that structure, they've formed line groups or whatever kind of groups, and they've done onnomi, or not onnomi, but online communication, tea parties, or communication with soft drinks and chips and these kinds of things, where they would actually try to get to know each other. So I think that's happening on the one hand. Club activities have suffered a little bit, but they've also been trying to generate some sense of community. The ones that have really succeeded are the ones that didn't require too much physical communication. So like the sports, athletic teams have struggled a little bit, but more of the ones that just are more of about discussion or communicating with each other, or creating some kind of publication or something. Those clubs haven't been as deeply impacted, I think. And so these kinds of organizations that the students have helped. The universities, I think our university was really trying to get the first year students back on campus at one point. Not necessarily the second, third, and fourth year students, but just the first year students to come back to school so that they actually can at least meet initially. And then if they go back, or if they can't meet on campus, at least they've met physically so that they could start building a community. So so that's been happening. I was doing an information session at school the other day, and that was a very rare opportunity to actually meet the students. And it was October, but I said, congratulations on entering the university. And they were just so beaming with, such a big smile. And, it's very difficult to get a beaming smile out of 19-year-old boys. So I was very happy about that. So there's definitely a sense of wanting to be there. And I think the universities really need to think a little bit outside the box in a way to manage that. That's not a real answer, but that's where
well, it's the reality, isn't it? And
yes.
Unfortunately, we're having to respond to the numbers, and schools are having to be very careful, particularly with older, the university sector, where there is spread because they are socializing, and they socialize independently. Another question was, Western education is one where individual students are encouraged to move at their own pace, but how do we keep those, help those who have fallen back? Japan is one where everyone has to meet a certain line, and how do we continue to ensure that? Any thoughts on that one? At the moment, I think everybody's kind of doing everything they can in both areas, I would suggest.
Yeah, I think, I don't know whether, is this, I think that's a really good question.
I mean, it's where I think everybody's having to be more flexible than they've ever been in both sectors. I think in Japan, it's difficult still with those sectors to still set a benchmark and expect everybody to meet it. But equally, as you quite rightly say, Sue, we can't really pander too much. We've got to be aware that kids want to learn and they want to get back on, and we've got to get that learning back going as quickly as we can.
And I can answer that question in relation to the system that I work in, because we do have students who are still working towards exams. So that's at 16 and at 18, even though the exams obviously didn't happen. But those children are on very designed curriculums and have clear benchmarks to work towards. And in some ways it's really focused them in terms of their learning, because the teachers have had to be really quite prescriptive around what the students have had to learn. They've put a lot of the content-driven work online, so the students, their assignments and their readings and their research, all that kind of thing has gone online. And then the times when they're actually back on Teams, then that's the feedback time when they're discussing what they found. They maybe have shared out their research, so they're coming back to collectively learn together, and the teachers facilitating it and moving the learning on quite quickly that way. It's pushing a lot of independence onto students, so it's very dependent on the motivation of the student, their ability to self-study and organise themselves and keep motivated. And I think that the skill of the teacher in those year groups has been to keep that pace going for the majority, and then work quite hard with those students who are finding that difficult, or maybe not getting the support they need at home.
Yeah.
Maybe
Go ahead, sorry.
Sorry, I have an anecdote that might be the kind of the other side of the coin here, which is I've got a friend who works in another university who's telling me that after the summer semester was done, she gave out all the grades, and she got a lot of inquiries about why they got B's or C's, because they just couldn't see where they were. So they in a way, they thought they had achieved the learning that was necessary. And there was no indication for them to think otherwise. So they were all expecting A's. And I think that's another way to maybe talk about how there's a bit of a difficulty in kind of communicating what's expected and what's not, and and whether also the instructor has been able to properly understand where the students were as well. So I think there's, especially in university, I think education, that's been a bit of a problem.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case. Okay, I've got there's a few more questions as we're coming in, but I want to just move on a little bit onto just talk about curriculum development a bit, because we do have an opportunity for this. And I wonder, Ziva, we've talked a bit about, post-primary education perhaps being too broad or too academic, too theoretical. Let's drill down a little bit more on, how do we see this as an opportunity to re-articulate curriculum, and how that might present itself in schools, but also, Yuko, how is that presenting itself in universities? What kind of programs are being developed which are enabling, a re-articulation of what we're offering?
Mm-hmm. Well, my opinion on this has always been that we keep children, if I can use this phrase, on probation for way too long before they finally are ready to get out into the real world. And I'm not entirely convinced it's correct. When we look at primary education, basic education, literacy, numeracy, getting that especially harmonized globally, I think is a great goal, and that needs to happen, and it needs to happen really well. But thereafter, providing a very broad education, and especially when children get to high school, really deepening that across the set of disciplines that we don't normally teach, mathematics, history, geography, economics, and so on. I'm not sure that is the right approach. To Sue's point, there has been Sue was mentioning that they experienced this sense of independence, that students have now acquired, and the content-driven stuff is being given to them, and then they come back and there's a lot of feedback and discussion. I think that's very healthy. One of the questions I would ask most schools and our approach to the curriculum is, why didn't we do that before? We're doing it now because we have to, but could we carry on doing that once things come back to normal? There's great benefit in that, because what it does is it forces, in a way, or nudges rather, a child to be more mature at an earlier age, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's part of their development. I think if we go and talk to universities, especially in the United States, and also to some extent in the United Kingdom, and we talk to professors about first-year undergraduates and the problems that they've observed, it's concerning. These adults don't know how to write is one of the first things you'll hear, and we have these in-depth, last-minute crisis management writing courses at universities. Could we not have fixed that earlier on? So I think writing, independent learning, treating children, especially post-primary students, not as children but really as adults who are getting prepared for a world that, by the way, the rate of change, the rate of technical change, the rate of cultural change is so great now that nobody can sit down and predict what the world's going to look like in 5, 10, 15 years time. And so we have very almost too confidently structured an education system to get these children ready for a world that we don't know. And so the question, if we are going to restructure curriculum, Kirsten, it should be, in my opinion, how do we get students ready for a world that we cannot predict?
And that's been a question we've been grappling with for for the last 2 decades of my life in education and beyond that as well. It's interesting that you raised the question of writing and also independent learning. And actually my company, Quest, those have been 2 of the areas that have been most requested in the last few months. Parents coming, looking for their children's ability to write academically, not necessarily in a creative sense, writing stories and so on, but more about being able to represent their learning articulately and creatively through academic writing, but also study skills, learning how to take notes, learning how to best use time. And I think as we look at the curriculum and as we continue to reflect on how we use time, now that time has become so valuable to us with this acute crisis situation, it's showing us where we've got a lot of things that we can strip away and really prioritize the important elements as they go through each sector of education. I think one of the areas that we need to touch on is exams. And it's interesting to think in primary terms. My background is primary, and I've always got that sort of constant desire to look at how we develop the curriculum there and maximize the time they have. But I know that in secondary schools, there's this kind of increasing burden the further they go through the school. And when you visit secondary schools and you hear teachers teaching, you'll need this for the exam is an expression that you hear quite regularly. Oh, you'll need to know this for the exam. And I wonder how on earth will we ever leverage change in those curriculums if the bind of having to get certain exam grades to take your next step into your next sector of education continues as it is. I mean, Yuko, we've talked over the last year about how you've managed to change the way you offered exams to your students. The open book approach, where you can have whatever books you want in front of you. It doesn't matter. I want to see how you use those materials. How are schools going to develop this? And I'm talking more about those 16 and 18-year-olds. Yuko, what do you think?
Yeah, big topic. I think, Joyce, following up on what Ziver was saying about the rate of change in technology and rate of change in culture, and if we think about, if you compare that with the rate of change in curriculum design, they don't match at all, right? And I think it's been allowed to lag behind. Curriculum change has been allowed to lag behind in a way. And it's mostly institutional barriers, I think, led by the government, but also probably not entirely the government's fault either. The universities haven't pushed for that either. So in which case, where does the change happen? I think the change happens in the public theater. Public opinion, I think, is the way that this can happen. And I think in a way, there's been a big hoo-ha with the entrance exams in Japan, getting into Japanese universities, and in particular, the English exams. And rather than just doing a written test or a written and listening test, the idea was to introduce a 4-skill based test. And so the idea was to make sure the students were prepared on all different skill sets. I mean, the 4 skill set idea is a little bit archaic maybe, but still for them to be better rounded with their English proficiency. It kind of backfired in the sense that the universities weren't happy to take on external exams like TOEFL or IELTS. And that's a separate issue. But I think the fact that industry was wanting better rounded, the economy was wanting better rounded English language proficiency helped push that narrative that this was necessary in university entrance exams. And I think that's definitely one huge strategy, an effective strategy that can be used. The second thing I'll say about this is when students prepare for tests, or when students have come into the university only having been prepared for exams, then you can tell the difference between students who've just done exam prep versus students who are actually got that intellectual agility and the creativity and innovative mind, that and also being well-rounded and well-read about certain issues. I think you can tell the difference. And so in a way, the universities need to help themselves by changing the way that they think about what kind of added value they want their students to have, and also what kind of preparedness they want their students to have as they enter university. So this is a kind of a bigger scale question. What's probably in the way of that discussion is this idea that, instructors or professors think that they want to keep the tradition because somehow it worked for them, so therefore it must be a good system. So it's a rather kind of self-indulgent way of thinking, but I think that doesn't help. And I think I think universities as a whole, the purpose of university needs to be kind of re-examined for sure.
I think this comes back to what you're saying, Ziva, about, we've got to think about who we're trying to create through these systems. And this is such an enormous topic. We could talk all night about exams because it's in every direction. There's the industry boards, the people who make money from exams. There's so many tentacles that this subject reaches out to. But until there's movement in the kind of the hearts and minds of all of us that change needs to occur, it really won't. I think that if I can sort of share one example of a green shoot in this area, that recently in the last couple of years, some of the independent schools in the UK have started to adjust their entry procedures to put a much higher emphasis on the interview aspect of the process. So of course the students are jumping through hoops to get through the interview. They've still got to get through the academic hoops, but they're almost putting an equal weighting on the, as you say, Yuko, the mental agility of those young people coming in. So how are they able to answer a very general question, drawing in knowledge and experience that they've had across a curriculum spectrum? And I would sort of purport that perhaps is the way that we need to go more in the higher up year groups, preparing them for university. Because as you say, Yuko, you can tell the difference between somebody who is prepared for a specific test and somebody who has read around a subject and has got an enriched range of cultivated knowledge about something, and that can be connected to other areas.
If I could just say a few words about that part. So regardless of how the students come in, the university's role and responsibility is to make sure that the students are well prepared for society. And because the curriculum is so rigid in a way, there's not a lot of wiggle room to change that. So what the universities then do is think of extracurricular activities that might supplement the curricular rigidity. And so some of the interesting things happen in universities are outside of like a department curriculum. It's maybe an honors program, or it's maybe like some other kind of certificate program. My university, for example, offers the Global Leadership Program. And that's basically inviting any student who wants to join from all the different faculties, from the humanities, social sciences, anything, not natural sciences, to come in, and they have to go through an application process. 100 students, up to 100 students are selected out of 3,000. And they work together in an interdisciplinary way. They're working on real global issues, not looking at the world through textbooks or through lectures, but actually engaging with the community, going to field work and talking to NGOs or whoever else, and trying to actually grapple with real life issues. And I think that's the kind of thing that Ziva is also talking about, like the students actually engaging in real terms about, and also thinking about solutions where the answers don't exist. And I think these are the kinds of things where they have to gather information, digest it, analyze it, and then try to come up with a reasonable and feasible solution to address issues. So I think these are the ways in which I think universities are trying to address real life.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely example, Yuko, of where innovation happens sometimes around the edges and then becomes mainstream. And I know in the context where I work, we're going through a really interesting evolution at the moment. We offer the IB diploma route and the A-level route for our 17 and 18-year-olds. And it's fascinating to see how that percentage is swinging towards IB now, and it's been moved quite rapidly because of Brexit coming along and university fees, etc. But also because the students and the parents see the benefit of working in on the IB program. This is where they've got much more opportunity to be involved in discussions, in service projects, for example, and actually to go into study in depth on particular topics. And the feedback we're getting from students is that when they go to university, they feel much more prepared as a student and as a learner, having gone through the IB program, than they may have on the A-level study program. And we've had to look at ways of like shoring up both. There's obviously benefits in both programs, but you want to make sure that all that innovation you've put into one is actually also supporting students on the other route. So all the pathways are giving them that breadth and preparation for when they go on. And I just see, again, what we're trying to do is bring in more of a vocational route for those students who maybe are not able to access some of the more academic programs at post 16, but actually have totally capable abilities and interests in hospitality routes, for example, or a business route, or something that will help them as they go on in their careers. And it's just up to schools to find ways to facilitate that. Obviously trying to make it cost effective as well and keep the quality up. I know there's all of those issues there too, but it's trying to offer students good quality routes through to further education.
The great thing about IB diploma and that one section of the IB is the breadth that it offers. And you know, students are not stopping studying maths at 16. They're not stopping studying a language at 16. They're not, you know, they've got English right to the age of 18, and that's just giving them so much more of a more structured platform upon which to be learners going forward, aren't they? And of course all the service and the project as well. And you know, A-levels work for some students, and if you're going into law or if you're going into accountancy, you need those, or you know, medicine, you need those too. So there's different pathways, aren't there? It's just, I wonder how secondary schooling, the secondary schooling sector will challenge the expectations of those exam boards enough to give more wiggle room to enable this wider thinking opportunity for students. And I think that this is a point at which, with this enormous kind of intake of breath that COVID-19 has created for education, this must be somewhere where we start planting our feet firmly in raising this conversation. I mean, we all watched well, frankly, we can only call it a debacle, can't we, from last year in the summer exams that those poor students experienced. We certainly don't want a repeat of that next year, but it has shown that the ground is moving, and we perhaps need to start thinking about that and mobilizing a little more. I just want to, you know, I'm conscious of time. We've got about 15 minutes left, and I thought we also should think about, as an educational profession, how, and Yuko, perhaps I'll direct this at you to start off with, but we'll open up wider. How can universities help address some of the current global challenges that we are facing, particularly when we're looking at in terms of political landscape and behaviours around fact and truth and opinion? What are your thoughts on that, and where's the leverage that we can find?
Yes, so a huge issue. My own academic background is in American studies and history, and so I go to American conferences in America. once in a while. And one panel that I went to that was quite interesting was, how do we teach evolution in a red state?
All I can do is laugh when I hear it.
And so the answer is gently. You just have to really tread carefully about what you're teaching and where you're teaching. And I was, by the end of that panel, I was very sympathetic to the people, not just the instructors who were trying to teach something about rational thinking, the trust in the scientific inquiry, reasoning, all these things. But I also felt a lot of sympathy for the students who were in these red states, Republican states, where, in very kind of religious communities, where students were perhaps learning something entirely different from what they were taught in their families. And in order to do well in the university, they had to either subscribe to a new idea or at least fake it so that they could get the good grades that they want. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about at the university level as well. And I think what I'm trying to say is there's so much, I think universities as a whole, universities are a product of the Enlightenment. And I think we tend to blindly subscribe to the Enlightenment and what it brings. But there's what we've discovered in the last year or two is that loads of people actually may not really subscribe to that idea. And so, what do you do with the kind of anti-Enlightenment folks that, it kind of rears its hand in the form of political populism? How do we, I don't want to get into the politics, but I want to bring it back to education. As educationalists, as teachers, modern education has been about enlightenment and how we teach that to children and students. But have we then excluded people from, have we disenfranchised people who believe in the kind of anti-enlightenment movement? I think this is probably a very controversial issue, but how do we, I don't know whether the argument is whether we make room for that or whether we do something else with it. But I think we need to kind of be rational and think about how many people actually feel like science is not trustworthy, or, all these things about rationality and reasoning that doesn't seem to necessarily resonate with lots of people. So, how do we kind of how do we deal with that? I think that's a question that we may need to think about as either in universities or just in education broadly.
Ziva, do you think that relates to how we consider curriculum moving forward when we think about logic and reasoning and rational thinking, facts, thought? You're on mute. Ziva, you're on mute.
Forgive me, I had notifications on my computer, so I tried to mute myself. Yeah, absolutely. I think I just want to quickly talk about IB. I myself studied the IB diploma program at UWC Swaziland, out of all places, and who I am now is still shaped by that experience. But a lot of that had to do with, I wouldn't say IB. I think it had to do with the specific pool of teachers and administrators and the community and the peers and then the culture of the school. And we really shouldn't discount that, because I've also really been shocked, to be honest with you, at how poorly the IB has been implemented and delivered in so many schools across the world. So yeah, it's a fantastic program if it can be implemented and delivered well. And so, if it is being delivered well, it's a testament to the leadership of that school. It's a testament to the quality of the teachers and the culture instilled. And coming back to your question, Kirsten, I think that it's interesting that Yuko mentioned that universities are there to get people ready for society. I feel like that should be happening earlier. Universities, you know, in my view, are really there to get people ready for the labor market. You know, that's, you know, become very employable and be able to be financially independent to some extent. But also universities are, you know, if you want to take that route, are places for research and asking very difficult questions, and it's a safe space where we can progress as a society. Yes, but there's no reason why we can't do this earlier. And, you know, to give you a very simple example, but when I was working in Hong Kong, we had this initiative that we launched, and it was very experimental, and we called the Global Challenges Initiative, where we had a list of questions that we came up with that need to be answered over the next 50 years, including how do we build a hotel on the moon, because we're going to have to answer that. We have to solve that problem. That's, you know, it's going to happen. And what we did, some of those questions were very specific to particular countries. And so we used Swaziland, where I grew up, as an example, because back then Swaziland didn't have a radiology clinic. And so there was so many illnesses, and health indicators are horrible there. And one of the reasons for that is because a lot of illnesses go undiagnosed. So we randomly selected four students across schools in Hong Kong with different areas of interest. And this was, two of them came from Ivy diploma program schools, other two from local schools. And we asked them this question: how can we feasibly build a sort of a viable radiology clinic in Swaziland? And we sat down with them for 2 weeks and taught them how to really do a good feasibility study. We gave them a template, and it was incredible what they started doing. You know, one of the students asked us to order these books on radiology clinic designs. These are postgraduate books, you know, and we ordered them, and they sort of downloaded a CAD program, and they started drawing all of this. This is where the MRI room should be for these reasons. The person who was more interested in business started calling companies in the Ukraine to get quotations on secondhand, MRI machines, and so on and so forth. And the feasibility study became so comprehensive and so professional that we funded their travel, and we took them down to Swaziland, and they actually presented this to the Ministry of Health, and it's right now sitting there, and it's something that's being considered. You know, these sorts of experiences can be designed, if you will, by educators, and what it does is it forces pupils to, number one, think about this, not only the survival of the individual, but the survival of the group, to develop empathy globally. Most importantly, it empowers them. You know, what I'm learning through sort of my theoretical underpinnings have a purpose, and I can actually apply them in this way to change something. It's a very empowering thing, and the earlier we can show that and demonstrate that for
yeah, it's there's certainly a lot to think about, and there are opportunities coming. I've got one short question for you, Sue, just to finish off. We're talking a lot about technology and integrating that into the curriculum. Have you got thoughts about screen time? Because this has been something we've been talking about for a while, but have you had any reactions from parents or from students about the amount of screen time impact?
Not so much, because the remote learning we put out is not all screen based, and we've done that very deliberately. But we do a lot of work with our families around safety online, screen responsibility, them helping their child to self-regulate around screen time, and it's more about what they're doing on the screen, you know, yes, and for how long and at what times of nights and things like that. Yes. And that's ongoing because it's changing all the time. And I feel that's kind of a necessary conversation, actually, that we as educators need to have parents, just to help and guide them around what works, what to do at home, what schedules to put in place, what other activities to put into young people's lives, the importance of outdoors, for example, exercise, bedtimes, that kind of thing. It's all the simple things that we just need to keep on going with. What we do a lot of is talk to parents about games that are now available, apps that are available, what's the in thing in the crowd, you know, so that the parents understand what it's about and why it might be helpful for a child or not. Because so much of this, they're just not, the parents don't even access. Yeah. So, you know, we're helping them sort of running alongside them. Yeah. So that as their child's getting used to this or getting access to it, they've got some kind of understanding of the benefits or not.
I think we always have to sort of almost admit really that if we know about it, kids are on to the next thing.
Yeah,
so, you know, whatever apps we're talking about right now, they're already onto the next level of, you know, we're talking about TikToks. We think we're cool thinking about TikTok, but they're already onto the next thing. So I think it's always useful to have.
Yeah, the interesting conversation that I'm having with parents at the moment is particularly the parents working at home, and it's how are you modelling, you know, a work day to your children if they're at home with you, or coming home at night and the parents are working late into the evenings, you know, because of their schedules. So that's something we also talk about, is like, what does that look like in terms of screen time and work? What does work look like to your child now you're at home?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And our work life and our work habits have really changed, haven't they?
Yeah.
Well, I'm very conscious of time. I want to thank everyone for joining us today and for posing some really interesting questions through the chat. I've been trying to read and thread them in as we've been going along. We hope you found the conversation interesting and have found some inspiration for your work, whichever sector you may find yourself in education. I want to say thank you to Sam and Sarah at the BCCJ again, and to the RSA Japan Fellows Network team, especially Kate, for all the help with the social media. And if you're keen to know more about both of those organisations and perhaps even become a BCCJ member or an RSA Fellow, please do get in touch or visit their websites. And if you're interested in more talk in education in Tokyo, please do follow the Facebook page there, where we post some interesting links and events. I want to say a final thank you to our speakers, to Sue, to Yuko and to Ziva. It has been an absolute pleasure talking with you this evening. Thank you so much for your time and for your expertise. And if I can leave you with one final thought as participants in this event, please do take care of the educators and the educational leaders around you. Crisis-driven change is exhausting. Things are challenging and relentless in schools and universities right now. They need our support, they need our encouragement, and I think a kind word or gesture never goes amiss. I very much look forward to more educational events in the future, so please do get in touch through Talk Education Tokyo or through the Facebook pages if you have some ideas or you want to get involved. Thank you very much, everybody, and again, thank you to our speakers.